This was kind of where we left off last week, so if you were here, this should be somewhat familiar. We talked about James I. He had been James VI of Scotland. We talked about his responsibility for the first two of those companies that established a toehold in the New World, the Plymouth Company, the London Company that became the Virginia Company. He also was able to maintain a kind of delicate, astute dance with the Puritans in England, which by this time had become fairly powerful and influential. He didn't have the power to just resist them openly. In England, the Parliament had sufficient power to more or less keep him somewhat curtailed in doing that. And at the same time, he was able to maintain his own authority as king. And so anyway, it was kind of that sort of complicated situation. Charles didn't have quite the savvy of James and came on a little bit more heavy-handed. And that was in some ways his ultimate undoing. So we talked last week about the fact that early on in his rule, he convened Parliament, as kings would do, because that's where he would get his revenue. Tax revenue came with the help of Parliament. Parliament had to enact these revenue bills. Parliament immediately confronted him with all kinds of complaints and demands under the influence of the Puritans, and rather than try to negotiate with them, Charles just dismissed Parliament. So for 11 years he ruled in England without Parliament, which is a good trick because Parliament was responsible for his revenue stream. To drive home his point, Charles launched what amounted to an ill-conceived but pretty brutal attack on the Puritans, using as his chief henchman a guy by the name of Archbishop Laud. And he's one of those names that if you've ever studied this chapter in history, then you've come across his name. This was the era in which many of the principles of due process that we cherish in our American constitutional governance got their inspiration, because these people did all the opposite stuff. This is kind of the Star Chamber experience. A trial's going on, you're the accused, and you weren't invited to participate, that kind of thing, you know. No opportunity to confront your accusers, anonymous witnesses brought to bear against you, that sort of thing, which we would consider a complete insult to any notion of a fair trial process. And really, in many ways, later when the Constitution was formed and notions of due process were enshrined in it, they were remembering this moment in which the very opposite was happening. So that was kind of the tactic that was being used by Charles II through Archbishop Laud. He would bring specious accusations against notable Puritan folks, try them, convict them, and even sometimes execute them, and they themselves had no opportunity to participate in it. That kind of thing, you see. So anyway, he was able to accomplish some things, but obviously was creating an awful lot of hostility against him, even among people who were not all that sympathetic to the Puritans there in England. John Bunyan, we're just going to keep an eye on his career, was born in 1628, so right at the kind of middle of this time. We talked about these two companies last week. I won't go back into that. What I would like to look at is sort of the undoing of Charles that takes place starting around the year 1638 or so. So this brings us to what's sometimes called the Scottish Revolt, or sometimes called the Bishops' War in English history. And this takes place beginning in 1638. It starts in 1637, and this is Charles now attempting to extend his influence into Scotland. Remember, Scotland is Presbyterian, and that touches both state and church. They have a robust idea of representative government. They still technically recognize the king, but in Scotland, the powers of the king have been significantly delimited by constitutional principles and so on. So in Scotland, Charles feels that he's kind of losing control. He's been able to make some headway as he sees it in England, although at the expense of a great deal of sort of PR points. In Scotland now, he wants to begin asserting his influence there. And so to do that, he sends a bunch of bishops up there, and they have in hand what's called the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer sounds pretty benign, but what it actually was a kind of script for worship that followed the highly Episcopal Anglican style of worship, both in terms of the liturgy of the church and also in terms of the theology of the church. And he basically says, you folks need to embrace the Book of Common Prayer. You need to get on board with what's going on here in England and the Anglican Church and so on. And so he goes up with these bishops and makes that assertion. The Presbyterian Church, of course, as you know, because you're all good Presbyterians, is organized according to various levels of authoritative bodies. We have the session, the presbytery, the synod, and the General Assembly. This was all the architecture of John Knox. And so the Presbyterian Church in Scotland said, okay, fine, we'll take a look at your Book of Common Prayer. And at their next General Assembly meeting, which was held in 1638, they spent probably, 15, 30 seconds looking at the Book of Common Prayer, and then they repudiated outright and in a rather pronounced way both the authority of the bishops who had come from England and the book. So the General Assembly just makes short work of that entire effort on the part of Charles. Well, Charles, of course, has been somewhat embarrassed by that and feels that maybe he needs to do an end run and appeal to the political authority rather than the ecclesiastical authority in Scotland and see if they'll just strong-arm this Book of Common Prayer. He believes the Parliament may be somewhat more sympathetic to him because they still have a fair representation of nobles who might be more sympathetic to the kind of monarchical rule that Charles represents. So he appeals to Parliament. Parliament says, okay, we'll take a look at it. And the Parliament affirmed the General Assembly with even more robust repudiation. So Scots, they're independent, and they just weren't going to be pushed around by Charles. And so now he's been slapped in the face twice. Once by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, once by the Parliament of Scotland. And of course, from Charles' point of view, the only thing he can do to save face is to muster some kind of military intrusion into Scotland to beat these people into submission. This is why Charles was not as smart as his father. James, I don't think ever would have made this mistake, because this was a losing proposition. And Charles just didn't seem to have quite the political savvy to appreciate the quicksand he was getting into here. But anyway, in order to put an army on the field, he needed money, and to get money, he needed Parliament. So he convened once again, now after 11 years, Parliament, again dominated by Puritans, who have been harassed and abused and persecuted for 11 straight years by Archbishop Laud, and are in no mood to cooperate. And so he's got this wildcat by the tail, he has Parliament there, and the first thing they do is demand that he arrest Archbishop Laud and try him for treason, and a few other choice requests, before they're even going to entertain his desire to raise money for this army. Well, Charles figures out right away this is not going to go anywhere good, and he dismisses that Parliament. And so that is called, in English history, the Short Parliament. And if you ever hear that term, it always refers to this moment in English history, the Short Parliament. Well, the Parliament wasn't so easily dismissed. And they decided, I think let's get back together on our own initiative. That was not technically permitted. It was supposed to be the king, but through a kind of adroit maneuver or two, they reconstituted that Parliament, and that has come to be called in history the Long Parliament. So you've got the Short Parliament and the Long Parliament, and the first thing the Long Parliament did was pass a law basically saying the only body that can dismiss this Parliament is this Parliament. And so they kept themselves in power for a good long time, and really were the dominant political force now over the next 10 years or so of this period that is kind of the English interregnum. All right, so Charles now has a problem because the first thing they did was they arrested Archbishop Laud, tried him, and executed him. So he's gone. Then they brought charges against Charles, basically impeaching him on crimes against the English people. So Charles now is facing a huge problem because this Parliament is not only not supporting him, but has become his worst enemy. And so, in one of the great ironies of history, Charles flees to Scotland. So the very triggering reason for calling this Parliament, namely a military action against Scotland, now becomes his safe haven. He runs to Scotland. And he says to the Scots, look, I'm still your king. I know we have our differences, but this Parliament in London has just run me out of town. You've got to support me. The Parliament in Scotland said, fine, we'll support you, as long as you agree to everything that we have required of you, endorsing the Presbyterian system in Scotland, both in the state and in the church. So they were in a bit of a bargaining position that was pretty strong, and that's what Charles agreed to. At the same time, of course, the Parliament in England essentially ousted Charles and asserted itself as the authority there. And that begins what then is properly called the Civil War in England that lasts for about 7 years or so. So the English Civil War begins. England is being governed by the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament has gotten mixed reviews by later historians. And my own assessment is the later you get, the more mixed are the reviews. The earlier assessment was this was really quite a remarkable group of people who had a lot of political insight and were pretty bright in trying to put together what amounted to a John Calvin, John Knox experiment in Republican government in England, as had taken place in Scotland, and that this was really what they were trying to achieve. And they were doing a pretty respectable job of accomplishing that. One historian from a little over 100 years ago said this. This is Charles Wentworth Upham. He says that this Parliament was, quote, a set of the greatest geniuses for government that the world ever saw embarked together in one common cause. They were trying to create an English political system along the lines of a Presbyterial design, you see, as had happened basically in Scotland. This is the Puritan republic now, at least at the beginnings of it, or attempt at it here in England. The further note, this Parliament and its Republican views were believed by many historians, especially at an earlier time, as being a significant precursor to the American Revolutionary War. Many of those who were involved in the Revolutionary War and the whole constitutional moment in America, in which there was an attempt to try to do something like this. You understand this, I hope. The U.S. Constitution is a Presbyterian document. Okay? Let's just step up and, make that clear. And they were following the kind of the lessons of history. They looked at Scotland. They, of course, looked at their own Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was also designed along the very same kind of parameters. They looked at the English experiment. The framers of the Constitution were aware of all of this and were kind of going to school on these lessons. Well, one of these experiments was what took place here. And so this is quite important for us as Americans to realize that what's happening here, though it ultimately failed, was nevertheless a schoolhouse for important lessons that would ultimately succeed for our own heritage as Americans. This Parliament also created the Westminster Assembly. The Westminster Assembly was a group of the finest scholars across England, most of them Puritan, not all, and their task was to create a companion piece to the English translation of the Bible that had come from James. So James gave us a new English translation, the King James, or authorized version, and now there was going to be a confessional statement, in a sense, to go along with it, to give the parameters, the design of the theology of the church now in England. And they, of course, generated what we know of as the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is commonly viewed as the granddaddy of Presbyterian confessional statements. It was built on John Knox, Scots Confession from 100 years earlier, but greatly expanded it. It is fully Calvinistic. There's probably no confessional statement in history that is more consistent with a Calvinistic vision, both of theology and of politics, although certainly theology is the dominant theme. I like the Westminster Confession of Faith. If you don't mind me being slightly personal here, it's one of the main reasons I'm a Presbyterian. I didn't grow up Presbyterian, as most of you know. I read the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the first thing I said is, where have you been all my life, because we didn't read it much in my Baptist tradition. Nothing against Baptists, but they're not big on confessional statements. And when I first started teaching here at First Presbyterian Church in 1984, the first class I taught that lasted for 3 years was a class on what? The Westminster Confession of Faith. Some of you were here. Joanna Plymley was here, and her wonderful husband, John, who was one of the most faithful attenders of that class. And I love that confessional statement. So whatever we think about this Puritan moment in England, let's be grateful for the Westminster Confession. That in itself was worth the price of admission, in my opinion. But anyway, that was another interesting part of it. Oliver Cromwell kind of rises into visibility at this point. He started as a member of the Long Parliament. He was born in kind of the gentry class in England. He was a man of considerable military genius. And so while the Long Parliament is meeting and sort of running the politics in England, Oliver Cromwell is responsible for carrying on the war against Charles and his followers. Charles, as you know, has gone to Scotland. He's rallied a small military support there based on agreeing to their Presbyterial sentiments. He also has a fair amount of support from the north of England. The north of England is more rural. Rural areas tend to be more conservative. It was true then. And their conservatism pointed back to the Anglican system and in some ways even back to the Catholic system. And so he was able to get a fair amount of support in the north of England and a certain amount of support in Scotland. And so he had a military force behind him trying to retake his throne. As it turns out, he was no match for the genius of Oliver Cromwell, and he lost a series of maybe a half a dozen battles over the next several years. He didn't do well in any of them, and Oliver Cromwell had more firepower and probably more native genius anyway. John Bunyan served in Oliver Cromwell's army. So he was part of what's called the New Model Army under Oliver Cromwell, and he had that military background as well during those years. He was not a Christian believer at that point, but he was nevertheless kind of in the broad sense fighting for the Cromwell and the Puritan side, though it wasn't really much of a heartfelt, faith-driven conviction. Charles I, as you probably know, was eventually defeated. He was captured, hiding somewhere in the north of England. He was brought back to London. He was tried on charges against the state, tried for treason basically. He was executed in 1649 by the Long Parliament. And so whatever you think of that, I'll leave to you, but that was the outcome. That opens the door then to what's called the Puritan Republic. And this is going to last until the year 1660. Oliver Cromwell, in the next couple of years, is responsible for what is universally viewed as the darkest moment of his career, because he takes a campaign into Ireland. Ireland had been very much supporting the wrong side of the campaign and was kind of a hotbed, in the view of Oliver Cromwell, of further rebellion, further conflict with England. They were technically under the crown of England and were now, in his assessment, in open rebellion. However, his tactics were ghastly. There was bloodshed, probably way over the top. It was a dark moment, and if you go to Ireland to this day, you'll find the name Oliver Cromwell is barely better than a curse word. He has a huge, black, dark reputation in Ireland, and it all goes back to this moment. And I'm not rising too much in his defense. The immediate circumstances, sometimes people do, things that are hard to understand 500 years later, but nevertheless, this was kind of a dark moment. So anyway, the Irish campaign happens then. And if anyone's ever a critic of Oliver Cromwell, they'll certainly zero in on that particular moment. That's followed over the next year with what's called the Scottish campaign, in which Cromwell, much to his own dismay, finds himself in a short battle with the Scots. He likes the Scots, and in fact you'll find that in Scotland there's not nearly the negative attitude toward Cromwell as in Ireland. But he does find himself having to fight a battle with the Scots. The way that happened was based on the son of Charles I, Charles II. During the Civil War, Charles II fled to France. He's related to the royal family there, and especially Louis XIV. And so Louis XIV cares for, protects Charles II, hoping that somehow he can engineer a reinstatement or a restoration of Charles to rule in England, as indeed eventually will happen. So there he is. There's a Charles II, good-looking guy. The Scottish Parliament recognized Charles II as their king. Remember, they've never repudiated monarchy. They've just limited monarchy. The English had repudiated it. But in Scotland, now that Charles I is dead, his son is the king, and so the Parliament in Scotland basically recognizes and acknowledges him. Charles II says, hot dog, I think I'll go to my land and start ruling. They say, wait a minute. Before you come, you have to sign a document that fully endorses every detail of a Presbyterian approach to church and state. Otherwise, even though you're the king, we're not going to let you into the land. You see, so the Scots are still pretty firm in that. So even though Charles didn't like the idea, he reluctantly endorsed Presbyterianism in Scotland at what's called the Treaty of Breda. Well, having done that, he now can return to Scotland, and once he's in Scotland, he's able to gin up a modest military force against the English and against Oliver Cromwell, and that's why Cromwell, though he really didn't have much stomach for it, finds himself in a battle with the Scots at that point. He actually appealed to the Scots to rethink what they had done. Oliver Cromwell felt that this was a grave mistake, that they should have quit while they were ahead, left Charles II home, and simply taken the next step to what was apparently the trajectory of their whole political philosophy in the first place. But they hadn't done that, and now here we are in a battle. And so Oliver Cromwell wrote a very deeply moving letter to the Scots Parliament, appealing to them to rethink this. But nevertheless, by this time, the wheels were in motion. It was a doomed attack. Charles II was no match, nor was the small army on his behalf of any match for Oliver Cromwell. So again, Charles II was defeated. He escaped. He went to Normandy, part of France, and that's where he is for the next 10 years, basically in exile. That leaves us now in England under this kind of Puritan republic, and Oliver Cromwell is himself at this point in the position of what's called the Lord Protector. It didn't work. And part of the reason that this entire period is viewed somewhat negatively, I think, by contemporary historical reviewers, is largely because of what took place, especially in these last few years. It's a kind of subtle point, and I have to just try to say it as simply as I can, but Oliver Cromwell was not a Presbyterian. He was a Congregationalist. He had strong misgivings about the Presbyterial vision of government, both in church and in state. He thought Presbyterianism is just one small step from going back into monarchy. It had too much of the flavor of a kind of monarchical system to it. He didn't like those levels of authority, you see. So he was a little bit more inclined toward a sort of majoritarian principle in government. Calvin, of course, had repudiated both. He'd repudiated a very hierarchical approach, but he also repudiated a fully democratic approach. He thought both were loaded with difficulties, and he had this sort of vision of a division of labor, balance of power, limited authority, official authority, that thing we've talked about before. Cromwell didn't quite get that. And really, in many ways, the meltdown that began to happen, in my opinion at least, during these next 10 years was because Cromwell was himself not robust enough in supporting that sort of Presbyterian vision. And basically what happens is you get a bunch of people who are not much better than anarchists who are trying to assert a political agenda. They had strange names like the Levelers and the Diggers and other people, and they were really appealing for almost a complete obliteration of all authority, almost in the style of Rousseau, a kind of great majoritarian principle of just pure democracy, and that did lead to increasing chaos in England. And the people who were more or less sensible in England tended, not making a good, clean distinction between the two, to blame the Puritans because of the bad things that seemed to be happening, as it seemed that the whole social order was beginning to sort of melt down. So I like Oliver Cromwell, but I think, unfortunately, he was a better military guy than a political philosopher. I don't think he quite got it. And by the time he died in 1558, you have what amounts to a situation where things are more or less spinning out of control. His son succeeded him in 1658. His son was not one fraction as competent as Oliver Cromwell. And so what happened was almost overnight, things went from bad to really, really bad. And it was just almost an open, chaotic kind of situation in England, which led Parliament now, which is increasingly ruled not so much by the Puritans, who have more or less fallen into disrepute, but more by kind of traditionalists to urge Charles II to come back and take over England as her next king. And so this is called the Restoration, and it takes place in 1660, and Charles II shows up, and he is now not only the King of Scotland, but in a more robust way yet, he is the King in England. He was crowned officially at Westminster Abbey in 1661. One of the first things he did was implement what's called the Clarendon Code. The Clarendon Code was a rule that said you could only preach if you had a license. It was one of many provisions, but that's the one we're interested in right at the moment. It was really reflecting the Anglican view that unless you were approved by the Anglican Church, it was illegal to preach. It was illegal to gather people in public assembly and to address them. Another principle we've enshrined in our Constitution, the right to freely assemble, you see, was prohibited here. That's what got John Bunyan into trouble, was that provision of the Clarendon Code. He was able to get away with this because the Puritan influence was waning. It was dropping off the radar, and because of that, you begin to see a return really more to this kind of hierarchical view of the church. And all of it, I think, in the part of the English people is understandable. They had just been through 20 years of what was viewed by them as chaos, and having a king looked pretty good compared to that. And so they were willing to support Charles to some degree. He did create problems for himself in 1662 when he married an openly Catholic woman named Catherine of Braganza. She was a Portuguese princess. That began stirring fears in Parliament. They were willing to be Anglican. They weren't so much willing to be Catholic, you see. But at the same time, the economy is improving in England. Things seem to be getting a little better. The Puritans are losing their influence, and these are all sort of the complicated themes that are sort of interwoven during these next several years. Charles himself secretly converted to Catholicism in 1670. That was not a smart move. Maybe it was heartfelt, but politically it was not a smart move because this secret conversion was not secret for very long. And it was at that moment that the two parties you've heard of in English history, the Whigs and the Tories, emerged. They were basically disputing the legitimacy of the heir to the throne, the son of Charles, who was James. That was the original inspiration of these two parties, but of course they took on a life of their own, and even in American history we had those two parties at one point. The Tories, of course, supportive of the crown and the king, the Whigs more the kind of more Republican type vision for England. Charles did the same. Charles II wound up doing the same thing that his father attempted to do, rule without Parliament. Parliament was now getting pretty hostile to Charles II, especially based on his conversion to the Catholic Church. So he's created problems for himself that are going to be difficult for him as well. He died in 1685, and I'm going to stop our narrative of English history there and take a look in the time we have left at a man who's living against the backdrop of these events. And so this is our friend John Bunyan, and I'd like to take a little time just to trace with you his story, which is taking place at this time. So John Bunyan, I'm calling him the English Pilgrim. We, of course, had American pilgrims. They landed at Plymouth Rock. He is the great English pilgrim, and he has a story to tell us in the times in which he's living. He was, as I said, born in 1628. He served in Oliver Cromwell's army just as a teenager. When that war was over, about 1650, he married. He married a woman who was an orphan. She was impoverished. Her dowry was 2 books. That's all she had to her name. That was good enough for John. He married her. Both of them were as poor as church mice at that point. He got a job as a tinker. Someone that fixes pots and pans, I guess. Maybe someone here knows more than I do about that, but that's my understanding. So he would go around. He had about 5 towns, and he was a traveling tinker. So he'd go from town to town and set up a little shop in the town square and fix, whatever your little household stuff was that was broken. He had quite a reputation for profanity at the time. We know all this about him because he wrote a very self-revealing and detailed autobiography while he was in prison. And so I'm basing the narrative I'm giving you right now on that document. So this is the source of this. And so he himself says that at the time he was quite given to vulgar cursing, profanity, etc. Would turn the air blue, as the expression goes, as he was conducting his trade. On one occasion he was arrested, however, by an old woman who came up to him. She was about half his size. He was kind of a burly guy, And she came up with her little finger and just waved it right in his face and said these words, by Bunyan's account: "You are the most ungodly fellow for swearing that I've ever heard. You will spoil all the youth of the town if you come into their company." And then she walked away, For some reason, that did get to John Bunyan. Strangely enough, and so he was quite disturbed at that indictment by this little old lady who'd come after him, and he decided he was going to fix his life. And so as he tells the story, he just kind of bit the bullet. He stopped swearing, just every time he just stopped, and he started studying a little bit of religion, and he just felt that he was becoming a better person. In fact, he says in his own description of this that he thought after a while, quote, "I please God as well as any man in England." He thought, he'd really achieved this kind of level of quality of moral virtue and so on that would even impress God. Then he describes on one occasion in the city of Bedford when he overheard a little group of women, probably 5 or 6 kind of homemaker, housewife type women that were discussing something, and he realized off kind of within earshot that they were talking about religious matters. And Bunyan, of course, styled himself now as someone who had become somewhat expert in religious matters, thought he might go over and help them out, enlighten them a little bit in their discussion. And so as he sort of moseyed over a little closer, this is what he says of what he heard, quote, "I drew near to hear what they said, for I was now a brisk talker also myself in matters of religion. But now I heard but understood not, for they were far above me, out of my reach. For their talk was about a new birth, the work of God in their hearts. They spoke as if joy did make them speak. They spoke with such pleasantness of scripture language and with such appearance of grace in all they said, that they were to me as if they had found a new world." And so Bunyan realizes that whatever these women are talking about and whatever is inspiring this conversation is something that is quite foreign to his experience. Not long after, he actually approached some of these women and began asking them, "What is up with this? What is it in you?" And they were not really in a position to even describe it very well. They sent him to their pastor. Remember, this is in the 1650s. This is before the Clarendon Code is kicked in. This is in that era when basically Oliver Cromwell is ruling. And so there is religious liberty at this point. This nonconformist pastor, John Gifford, he's not in the Church of England, he's not a Puritan either, he's a nonconformist, is the pastor of the little church in Bedford, and John Bunyan goes and begins discussing with him these matters. And as he was talking with John Gifford, Bunyan describes in these words his experience, quote, "These words did suddenly break in upon me. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. 3 times together. And oh, I thought that every word was a mighty word unto me. He continues in that same text. And then this verse from John 6:37, whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. I saw it was not my good frame of heart that made my righteousness better, nor yet my bad frame that made my righteousness worse, for my righteousness was Jesus Christ himself, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Bunyan says, I thought I could have spoken of his love and mercy even to the very crows that sat upon the plowed lands before me. And so his, what we would call evangelical conversion, true heartfelt conversion to the Christian faith, appears to have happened, of course, at this point under the ministry of this nonconformist pastor, John Gifford. Well, shortly after his conversion, John Bunyan added to his skills as a tinker the additional skill as a preacher. He couldn't help but preach. At the beginning, his sermons were pretty simple, pretty, two-dimensional, but his depth in the Scripture rapidly accelerated, and he became quite a remarkable and impressive preacher early on. 1660. Charles II has been reinstated to the throne. He is just implementing the beginnings of the Puritan Code. One of the provisions is that you don't preach without a license. John Bunyan was scheduled to preach, again in the city of Bedford. There was a constable there, and it was fairly obvious the constable was looking for John Bunyan to see whether he would indeed preach, and thereby give reason to be arrested. One of the leaders in the church said to John, this is John describing it, "Brother, do you think it wise to proceed with the meeting? Perhaps we should call it off for another day." Bunyan says he responded, "No, by no means. I will not be stopped. Neither will I have the meeting dismissed for this. Come, be of good cheer. Let us not be afraid. Our cause is good. We need not be ashamed to preach God's word. To preach God's word is so good a work that we shall be well rewarded if we suffer for it." Bunyan began preaching. Mid-sermon, the constable walks in, basically cuffs him, And as he's being taken out of the meeting house, the last words that Bunyan said to the congregants who were there was, quote, "It is a mercy of God to suffer for doing good. Better by far to be the persecuted than the persecutors." And so he's hauled away, and he's tried. And this from now the trial, as Bunyan recalled the conversation with the judge. The judge says, quote, "Why do you go to such meetings and preach? You're a tinker. Why don't you follow your trade? It's unlawful for you to carry on religious services as you do." Bunyan replied, "I do follow my calling and preach the word too. I look upon it as my duty to do them both as I have opportunity." The judge said, "Mr. Bunyan, I intend to send you to jail unless you promise to stop preaching and calling the people together." Bunyan replied, "I shall not stop preaching or speaking the word of God. I shall continue to counsel, comfort, and teach the people that desire it. I think that this is a work which has no harm in it. It is worthy of commendation and not blame." Then the judge hit the raw nerve. "Do you not love your children?" Bunyan replied famously and powerfully, "Indeed I do, very dearly. But in comparison with Jesus Christ, I do not love them at all." It does bring back that statement by Jesus himself. Remember, unless a man hates father, mother, brother, sister, etc., for the sake of the kingdom, he's not worthy of it. Powerful words by Jesus, and in some ways reflected here by Bunyan. The judge concluded away to prison with you, and Bunyan, for 12 years, was in the Bedford jail. And it's during those years, as I mentioned to you earlier, he clung to Jeremiah 49:11. Leave your orphans, I will protect their lives. Your widows too can trust in me. He made leather shoelaces all during those years that he was in prison, and those were sold, and the revenue from that went to the support of his children. So he was able to do something for them, but not able to be with them in any personal way very much. During that time, he wrote 12 books. He was there 12 years, one book a year, you know. One of those books was entitled Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which is his autobiography from which I'm drawing these comments this morning. He also continued to preach. I mean, you're in jail, you know. How much worse can it get? People would crowd into the jail, they were permitted to come, and listen to him preach in jail to them every week. And so there continued to be services in the Bedford jail as all who could crowd into that little enclosed space. He was released in 1672. This is when Charles was kind of getting into some awkward circumstances himself with his Catholicism, etc. And there was a relaxing of the Clarendon Code, and Bunyan was released, whereupon he immediately began preaching and preached for the next 3 years. And then things tightened up again. And he was put back in jail, this time for only 6 months. We're very grateful for that 6 months because it's then that he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And that classic has, of course, been one of the best sellers, not just of Christian history, but of human history. It's a remarkable piece of literary art. And I just know every one of you in this room has read it. My appeal to you is read it again. Read it again. I was trying to think of it. I think I've read it 3 times in my life. Once when I was in my 20s, once when I think I was in my mid-30s, and then once about 5 years ago. And I have to say to you, every time I read it, it's a new book. You see new things. You see new lessons. The depth of the subtlety with which he treats the experience of the Christian life that every one of us in this room can identify with. If you are a Christian person, you will see yourself in the pages of that book, and sometimes different ways at different times in your life warrants reading it and rereading it. So it does deserve the wonderful reputation that it has had. He was released 6 months later. Pilgrim's Progress was an overnight and sweeping sensation and success. And John Bunyan himself became one of the most famous people in England, certainly during that era, probably the most famous Christian preacher in England. He preached to huge crowds for the next 12 years or so until his death in 1688. And he had a magnificent impact, and even though he had to pay for his heartfelt faith dearly over those years, I don't think he would do it any differently if you were to hand him some options at the time. Just as a little teaser, a little trailer, I'm going to read to you the first paragraph, and I'm hoping you'll run right home and read the next maybe several pages of Pilgrim's Progress. Bunyan starts his book saying, "As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted upon a certain place where there was a den. And I laid me down in that place to sleep, and as I slept, I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. I looked, and I saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able to contain, he brake out with a lamentable cry, saying, 'What shall I do?'" Every human person at some point comes to a moment in their life, do they not, when they say, "What shall I do?" And at that critical juncture, some turn to Christ, who is the only explanation, not only for what you should do, but for why you should do it, and even why you're there asking the question. And others turn away and pursue a course that can ultimately never answer that question adequately. It's a wonderful book. It explores deeply those issues, and I commend it to you, and with that, I will wrap up.